Please be advised that these tales are in the original, unadulterated form. As such, they bear little resemblance to the sanitized Disney versions of today and can contain graphic imagery. We recommend you review the text of each episode in advance. These are found at www.bedtimestorybroadcast.com. Thank you for your attention, and now on with the show. Children, do you know what time it is? It's story time, children! It's story time! It's story time, children!
Bedtime!
Bedtime!
Story! Yay!
Welcome to Bedtime Story Broadcast. My name is Crystal Genduso, and I am your host this evening. Part 2 of The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, a Prussian novella by E.T.A. Hoffman. Chapter 5, The Battle, narrated by Crystal Genduso. And it wasn't long before a swarm of very ugly mice came and knocked the whole thing over, stool, guns, and gunners alike. Nutcracker looked very worried and ordered the right wing to retreat. Those of you who have led any battles yourself will know that retreating is no different than running away. And I'm quite sure that you feel just as sorry as I do that things turned out so badly for the army of Marie's beloved Nutcracker. But let us turn from this now and look at the left wing of Nutcracker's army, where everything is still going well and there's hope for the soldiers and their general. During the worst of the battle, cavalry mice waiting quietly under the bureau threw themselves upon the left wing of the Nutcracker's army with horrible squeals and squeaks. But what resistance they found! Slowly, because of the difficult terrain, that is, the edge of the cabinet, the standard bearers, under the command of 2 Chinese emperors, had moved over and formed a square. These brave, colorful, and splendid troops consisted of gardeners, Tyroleans, Tunguses, barbers, harlequins, lions, tigers, monkeys, apes, all of whom fought with composure, courage, and determination. With Spartan bravery, this elite battalion would have snatched the victory from the hands of the enemy had not a bold captain of the Mouse Cavalry daringly bit off the head of one of the Chinese emperors, who in turn killed 2 Tunguses and a monkey as he fell. This formed a gap that the enemy could penetrate, and soon the whole battalion had been gnawed through. But the enemy gained little advantage from this unfortunate turn of events, because every mouse who viciously bit into the middle of his valiant opponent got a printed piece of paper lodged in his throat, and he immediately choked to death. Despite this small gain, things were looking bad for the Nutcracker's army. Once they began to fall back, they found themselves falling back further and further and losing more people until all that remained was a small group backed against the cabinet. "Bring up the reserves," Nutcracker ordered. "Pantaloon, Scaramouche, Drummer, where are you?" He was hoping for fresh troops from the glass-fronted cabinet. Some brown men and women with golden faces, hats, and helmets appeared, but they were so awkward with their swords that they were no help at all. The only thing they managed to knock down was General Nutcracker's hat. The enemy chasseurs had soon bitten off their legs, and when they fell, they crushed and killed more of Nutcracker's men. The enemy drew closer still, and there was no escape. Nutcracker would have jumped up to the cabinet's ledge, but his legs were too short. Madame Clairette and Madame Trudy could not help him, for they both laid in a faint. Hussars and dragoons sprang past him into the cabinet. In desperation, he called out, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" But at that moment, 2 enemy marksmen took hold of Nutcracker's wooden cloak and held him fast. Squeaking in triumph from 7 throats, The Mouse King sprang forward to take his kill. Marie could no longer keep what little composure she had, and without really knowing why, she removed her left shoe and threw it as hard as she could into the thickest patch of mice she could see, right at their king. At that moment, everything faded from Marie's vision. She felt a stabbing pain in her arm and fell fainting to the floor. Chapter 6: The Illness. Narrated by Courtland Johnson.
Marie awoke from a death-like sleep to find herself in her own bed. The sun was shining through the window, making the frost on the panes sparkle and shimmer. Sitting nearby was a stranger. No, Dr. Windlestern, the surgeon. "She's awake now," he said in a soft voice. Her mother came over and looked at Marie with frightened, searching eyes.
"Oh, Mama, dear, are all the mice gone? Is good Nutcracker safe?"
"Don't talk about nonsense like that, Marie. What do mice have to do with the Nutcracker? You've been a very naughty child and worried us very much. That's what happens when a child is willful and doesn't do as her parents tell her. You played with your dolls until you became sleepy, and it may be that a mouse, which I find unlikely, jumped out and frightened you, and you fell back and pushed your arm through the glass. Dr. Windlestern, who removed the glass from your arm, says if you'd cut an artery, you might have been left with a stiff arm, or bled to death. Thank God I woke up after midnight and noticed you weren't in your bed. I went into the living room and found you passed out in front of the toy cabinet, bleeding heavily. I almost fainted from the shock myself. And then I saw Fritz's soldiers, a lot of other dolls, and broken banners, gingerbread men, and not far away, your left shoe."
"Oh, Mama, Mama,"
Marie interrupted.
"don't you see? That's what was left of the battle between the dolls and the mice. The mice wanted to take the Nutcracker, and I got scared, so I threw my shoe at them. And after that, I don't know what happened."
Dr. Windlestern glanced at Mrs. Stahlbaum, then said to Marie very gently, "There's no need to worry, my dear child. The mice are all gone, and Nutcracker is safe in the toy cabinet." Then the physician, that is, Marie's father, came in and spoke with Dr. Windlestern for a considerable length of time. He took Marie's pulse, and she heard mention of wound fever. She had to stay in bed and take some medicine for a few days, though aside from the pain in her arm, she didn't really feel ill or uncomfortable. She now knew that Nutcracker had escaped the battle safe and sound. Occasionally, she would hear, as if in a dream, the Nutcracker's voice, distinct yet weak. "Marie, dear lady, I already owe you so much, but there is more you could do for me." Marie tried to think of what it could possibly be, but she could think of nothing. She could not play with her toys because of the pain in her arm, and the illustrations in the picture books swam before her eyes until she had to give up on them. And so time seemed to draw on forever. She could hardly wait for evening, because then her mother would come and read her all sorts of beautiful stories. One evening, her mother had just finished the story of Prince Facardin when the door opened and Godfather Drosselmeyer stepped into the room. "Now I must see for myself how the sick and injured Marie is doing," he said. As soon as Marie saw his yellow coat, the image of the Nutcracker losing the battle against the mice came back into her mind. Automatically she said,
"Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you were so ugly. I saw you up there on the clock, covering it with your wings so it couldn't strike and scare away the mice. I even heard you call the Mouse King. Why didn't you help the Nutcracker or me, you ugly Godfather Drosselmeyer? It's your fault that I'm hurt and sick and stuck in bed, isn't it?"
Marie's mother, shocked, asked, "What is wrong with you, Marie?" However, Godfather Drosselmeyer made an odd face and said in a rasping, monotonous voice, "The pendulum had to purr and pick. It could not strike, nor could it tick. But now the bells sound loud and strong. Dong and ding, ding and dong. Doll girl, don't be afraid. The king of mice has gone away. The owl returns now swift and quick. pick and peck, peck and pick. Bells ring, dong and ding, clocks whir, purr and purr. Pendulums must also purr, clink and clank, whir and purr. Marie stared wide-eyed at Godfather Drosselmeyer. The judge looked somehow uglier than usual, and his right arm was moving back and forth as if he were manipulating a marionette. Marie would have been very frightened had it not been for her mother's presence, and for the fact that Fritz, who had quietly crept in, suddenly burst out in loud laughter. "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you're too funny," Fritz said. "You're just like the jumping jack I threw behind the stove a while back." But their mother had a serious expression on her face, and said, "Dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, what odd entertainment. What is it all about?" "Heavens," the judge responded with laughter. "Don't you know my watchmaker's ditty? I always sing it to patients like Marie." He quickly sat close beside Marie's bed and said, "Don't be angry at me for not putting out all 14 of the Mouse King's eyes, but I've got something for you that I think will make you really happy." With those words, he reached into his pocket and swiftly pulled out the Nutcracker. His missing teeth had all been firmly set back in, and his wobbly jaw was set straight again. Marie shouted with joy, and her mother said, "See how well Godfather Drosselmeyer thinks of Nutcracker." "You still have to admit, Marie," Drosselmeyer interrupted, "he's quite ugly. I'll tell you how such ugliness came into his family, if you want to listen. Or maybe you already know the story of Princess Pirlipat, the Witch Mousetrap, and the Clockmaker." "Wait a minute," Fritz said suddenly. "You fixed the Nutcracker's teeth and jaw, but he's got no sword. Why is he missing a sword?" "Oh," Drosselmeyer responded indignantly, "you have to complain about everything, boy. Why should I find him a sword? I fixed his body. It's up to him to get a sword if he wants one." "That's true. If he's any good, he'll know where to find his weapons." The judge turned again to Marie. "So, Marie, do tell me, do you know the story of Princess Pirlipat?" "Oh, no," Marie said. "Do tell, dear godfather, do tell." "I hope, dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, that your story won't be as horrible as the ones you usually tell," her mother said. "Not at all, dear lady," Drosselmeyer replied. "On the contrary, the story which I have the honor of telling is a fairy tale." "Tell us the story, dear godfather," the children begged, and so he began.
Chapter 7, The Tale of the Hard Nut, narrated by Joshua McGill.
Pirlipap's mother was the wife of the king, and therefore the queen, and that made Pirlipap a princess from the very moment she was born. The king was beside himself with joy at the sight of his beautiful little daughter. He whooped and hollered and swiveled around on one leg, and cried out again and again, "Oh, joyous day! Have you ever seen anything more beautiful than my Pirlipap?" And the ministers, generals, and staff likewise spun on one leg and cried, "No, never!" Anyone who had seen the little princess could not deny that she was probably the most beautiful little girl in the whole world. Her face was like the finest lily white and rose-red silk ever woven. Her lively little eyes were like 2 sparkling azure stones, and her curly hair was like threads of pure gold. In addition, Princess Pirlipap had come into the world with 2 rows of pearly white teeth, which she used for the very first time when she bit the finger of the chancellor, who tried to get a better look at her face. The chancellor cried out, "Oh, Jiminy!" Or maybe it was, "That hurt!" Opinions to this day are divided on the matter, but Pirlipap had most certainly bitten the chancellor's finger, and the delighted kingdom knew at once that their princess was spirited, sharp, and clever. All were cheerful and merry, all except the queen, who looked anxious and fearful for reasons no one knew. In addition to the 2 guards standing outside the door of the princess's room, the queen had ordered that 6 female attendants sit closely around her cradle every night. What seemed completely mad and utterly incomprehensible to everyone, however, was that each attendant had to hold a tomcat on her lap and stroke him so that he never stopped purring. It's impossible for you, dear children, to guess why Pirlipap's mother gave these orders, but I know, and I shall tell you. It had happened some time ago in the royal court that many splendid kings and excellent princes were gathered. It was a marvelous affair. There were jousts, comedies, and dancing. In order to show that he wasn't at all lacking in gold or silver, the king took a sizable sum out of the royal treasury to do something really spectacular. Having heard from the head chef that the court astronomer had privily told him that now was the proper time for slaughtering the livestock, the king ordered a preparation of a lavish sausage feast. Then he threw himself into his carriage and invited all the kings and princes to have a spoonful of soup so he could enjoy their surprise when they saw what he had really planned for them. Then he approached his queen and said very kindly, "You do know, sweetie, how I like sausages?" The queen knew what he meant, that she, as she had done in times past, should take up the useful job of sausage making. The chief treasurer immediately had the golden sausage boiler and silver casserole dishes sent to the kitchen. A roaring fire of sandalwood was set ablaze, and the queen put on her damask apron. It wasn't long before the delicious smell of sausage soup wafted out of the boiler and into the council of state. The king was seized with such delight that he could not contain himself. "Pardon me, gentlemen," he shouted, and leapt away to the kitchen where he hugged the queen and stirred the soup with his golden scepter. Feeling much better, he returned to the council. The crucial moment had come in which the fat had to be cut into cubes and roasted on silver grills. The ladies-in-waiting left the kitchen because the queen wished to perform this task alone, out of love and devotion to her royal spouse. As soon as the fat began to sizzle, a tiny little voice called out,
"Give us some of that fat, sister. I am also a queen, and I deserve a feast too. Give me some fat."
The queen knew it was Lady Mousetrap. Lady Mousetrap had lived for years in the palace and claimed to be related to the royal family, and even queen of a realm called Mouseland. She also claimed to have a large court under the stove. The queen was a good and charitable woman, so although she didn't recognize Mousetrap as a queen or a sister, she was willing to let her enjoy the feast as well. "Come out and you may have some of my fat," she said. Lady Mousetrap jumped out, hopped up to the stove, and grabbed piece after piece of fat from the queen in her delicate little paws. But then came her cousins, aunts, uncles, and her 7 sons, and the latter were such unruly brats that they ran all over the fat, and the terrified queen could do nothing to stop them. Fortunately, the head lady-in-waiting came in and chased away the unwanted guests before all of the fat could be gobbled up. The court mathematician was called in, and he calculated how best to distribute what was left of the fat among the sausages. Trumpets and drums sounded. The kings and princes arrived, some on white horses, some in crystal coaches, and all in their best clothes. The king greeted them cordially, then sat down at the end of the table in kingly dignity, with his crown on his head and his scepter in his hand. During the liver sausage course, the king gradually grew paler and raised his eyes towards the heavens. A sigh escaped his chest as if some enormous pain was digging in his insides. During the blood sausage course, he fell back into his chair, sobbing and moaning, with both hands over his face. Hearing the king's wailing and howling, everyone jumped up from the table. The court physician tried in vain to take the unfortunate king's pulse. A deep, nameless misery seemed to be tearing him up. Finally, after much persuasion and attempts to use the strongest remedies available, feather quills and such, the king stammered in a barely audible voice, "Too little fat." The queen threw herself at his feet in despair and cried, "Oh, my poor unfortunate royal husband! Oh, what pain you've had to endure! You see the guilty one here at your feet. Punish her hard! Lady Mousetrap and her cousins and uncles and aunts and 7 sons have eaten the fat." With that, the queen fell back in a faint. The king jumped up and demanded, "Chief lady-in-waiting, how did this happen?" The chief lady-in-waiting told him all she knew, and the king decided to take revenge on the Lady Mouserings and her family. The Privy Council was summoned, and it was decided that Lady Mouserings would stand trial and all her property would be confiscated. But the king was worried that Lady Mouserings and her family would go on eating his fat in the meantime, so the task of solving the problem was given over to the clockmaker and the wizard. The clockmaker, whose name is the same as mine, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, promised to rid the palace of Lady Mouserings and her family forever. He created many small and very intricate little machines, into which a piece of fat was placed and set near the home of Lady Mouserings. Lady Mouserings was too clever to fall for it herself, but despite her warnings, all of her cousins, aunts, uncles, and even her 7 sons went after the fat. Just as their greedy little paws reached for the fat, a grate slammed shut, trapping the lot of them. Then they were promptly taken to the kitchen and executed in disgrace. Fearing for her life, Lady Mouserings left the castle with what family she had left. Grief, despair, and rage filled her chest. All of the royal court cheered, all except the queen, who was worried. She knew what sort of woman Lady Mouserings was, and that she would not let the deaths of her sons and her family members go unavenged. Indeed, Lady Mouserings appeared one day when the queen was preparing another one of the king's favorite dishes, and said,
My family is dead. Take care, my queen, that the Mouse Queen does not bite your little princess to pieces. Take care.
The Lady Mouserings disappeared from sight. The queen was so startled that she dropped the food she was preparing into the fire. For the second time, Lady Mouserings had spoiled one of the king's favorite dishes, which made him very angry. Well, that's enough for tonight. I'll tell the rest later. As much as Marie, who had her own thoughts about the story, asked her godfather to tell the rest of it, he refused. He jumped up, saying, Too much at once is unhealthy. I'll finish it tomorrow. Just as the judge was about to leave through the door, Fritz asked, But tell me, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it really true that you invented the mousetrap? How can you ask such a silly question? Their mother asked him. But the judge smiled strangely and said quietly to Fritz, Am I not a clever enough clockmaker that I could invent a mousetrap?
Chapter 8, Continuation of the Tale of the Hard Nut. Narrated by Kevin Hogan.
Now you well know, the judge told the children the next evening, why the queen was keeping their beautiful princess so carefully guarded. How could she help but worry that Lady Mouserings would return and make good on her threat to bite the princess to death? Drosselmeyer's contraptions were of no use against the clever and shrewd Lady Mouserings, and the court astronomer, who was also the royal family's private astrologer, had said that Mr. Purr and his family would be able to keep Lady Mouserings away from the cradle. Therefore it happened that every attendant was ordered to hold a tomcat on her lap and stroke his back to make his job a little less tedious. One night, at midnight, one of the attendants woke from a deep sleep. The room was as silent as death. There was not a purr to be heard. One could have heard the woodworms nibbling at the timbers. Then she saw a large, ugly mouse standing on its hind feet near the princess's face. With a frightened cry that woke everyone else, the attendant jumped to her feet. Lady Mouserings, for it was none other, ran into a corner. The cats ran after her, but they were too late. She disappeared into a crack in the floor. Just then, Pirlipat woke up from the noise and began crying pitifully.
Thank heavens she's alive,
they said. But what horror awaited them! Instead of an angelic little face and a perfect little body, a hideous and huge head was attached to a shrunken and shriveled body. Her sparkling azure eyes had become staring green eyes that almost looked as if they popped out of her head, and her sweet little mouth now stretched from ear to ear. The queen shut herself away in mourning, and the walls of the king's study had to be padded because he would often bang his head against the walls and cry most pitifully.
Oh, what an unhappy monarch am I!
One might think that he might have realized that it may have been better to go on eating his sausages without fat and leave Lady Mouserings and her family in peace under the stove, but he didn't. Instead, he put all the blame on the court clockmaker and wizard, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg, and issued him an order. Restore the princess to her former self within 4 weeks, or find a cure that was certain to work, or suffer the disgraceful death of beheading. Drosselmeyer was in no small state of terror, but he trusted in his craft and in luck to set the first thing that seemed useful to him. He carefully took the little princess apart without harming her and examined her internal structure. But all he could discover was that the larger the princess grew, the worse her condition would become. He put the princess back together again and sat down by her cradle in despair, which he was not allowed to leave. It wasn't till the 4th week, Wednesday in fact, when the king looked at Drosselmeyer with eyes flashing with rage and cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, cure the princess or die!" Drosselmeyer began to cry bitterly, but Princess Pirlipat happily cracked nuts. For the first time, Drosselmeyer took note of the princess's unusual appetite for nuts, which she cracked with the very teeth she had been born with. In fact, the princess had cried for hours after her transformation, until a nut chanced to roll by. She promptly snatched it up, cracked it open, and ate the core, and immediately quieted down. Since then, all attendants were advised to bring nuts whenever they came in.
Oh, unholy and unfathomable instincts of nature, present in all things!
Christian Eliot Drosselmeyer cried.
You now show me the door to the answer to this mystery. I will knock, and it will open!
He immediately requested to speak with the court astronomer, and was led by guards to him. Both men tearfully embraced each other, for they were close friends. Then they went together into a secret room, where they consulted many books concerning instincts, sympathies, antipathies, and other such mysteries. When night fell, the astronomer looked to the stars, and with the help of Drosselmeyer, who was also quite familiar with astrology, took the princess's horoscope. It was no easy task, for the lines of the stars were so crossed and tangled. But at last, it became clear that in order to break the curse and restore the princess's beauty, all she would have to do was eat the sweet core of the Nutcracker. Now, the Nutcracker had such a hard shell that you could run the wheel of a cannon over it without breaking it. This nut had to be given to a young man who had neither yet shaven nor worn boots, and he would have to bite it open before the princess and give the core to her with his eyes closed. What's more, he could not open his eyes until he had taken 7 steps backward without tripping or stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer worked for 3 days and 3 nights. That Saturday, the king had sat down for his midday meal when Drosselmeyer, who was scheduled to be executed the following Sunday, joyously rushed into the room and announced that he had found the means to restore the princess's lost beauty. The king gave Drosselmeyer a fierce bear hug and promised him a diamond sword, 4 medals, and 2 new Sunday suits. "After lunch, I expect you'll get to work on this," the king added amiably. "And I trust, excellent wizard, that you'll make sure that this young man with the Nutcracker in his hand hasn't had any wine to drink so he doesn't trip when he goes walking 7 steps backward like a crab. Afterward, he can drink all he wants." Drosselmeyer was dismayed at this, and with trembling fear informed the king that he had neither begun to search for the nut or the boy to crack it, and it was uncertain whether nut or Nutcracker would ever be found. The king waved his scepter high above his head in a rage and roared, "Then the beheading shall proceed as scheduled." Fortunately for Drosselmeyer, the food had tasted particularly good that day, and the king was in a better mood than usual. This made him more open when the queen, who was touched by Drosselmeyer's distress, and asked that he reconsider. Drosselmeyer gathered his courage, and explained that he had indeed found out how to cure the princess, and therefore rightfully wanted his life back. The king decided that Drosselmeyer was stalling with silly excuses, but after taking a tonic for his stomach, he announced that both the clockmaker and the astronomer should set off on foot and not return until they had the Nutcracker in their possession. The queen suggested that they could find the man to do the cracking by regularly placing advertisements in local and foreign newspapers. And here the judge broke off again, and promised to tell the rest of the story the next evening.
For those of you just joining us, you are listening to Bedtime Story on Radio Fairfax. For more information about the show and to access other resources, visit www.bedtimestorybroadcast.com. Special thanks to Jacob Daniels for his assistance with editing this episode. Chapter 9, Conclusion of the Tale of the Hard Nut, narrated by Joshua McGill.
On the 3rd evening, the lights had barely been lit in the Stahlbaum house, when the judge returned to finish his story. Drosselmeer and the astronomer searched for 15 years without coming across the Nutcracker. I could spend 4 weeks telling you children all about the places they went and the strange things they saw, but I'll just say that Drosselmeer, in his deep sorrow and disappointment, began to feel a longing for his beloved home city of Nuremberg. A particularly nasty attack hit him when he was smoking his pipe with his friend the astronomer in the middle of some great forest in Asia, and suddenly he cried, "Oh, beautiful, beautiful Nuremberg! My beautiful hometown Nuremberg, whom I have not seen for so long, though I have traveled to London, Paris, and Petrovaradin. They cannot fill my heart, and I must always ask of you, O beautiful city of Nuremberg, with your lovely houses and their windows." Drosselmeer's cries were so sorrowful that the astronomer felt deep compassion for him, and began to cry and wail as well. In fact, his cries were so loud that they could be heard through a sizable portion of Asia. Then he wiped his eyes and said, "Esteemed colleague, instead of sitting here pining away over Nuremberg, why don't we go to Nuremberg? After all, it doesn't matter where we search for that accursed nut." "True," Drosselmeer said. He brightened up a little. They both knocked the ashes out of their pipes and straightway headed from the middle of Asia to Nuremberg. No sooner than they had arrived, Drosselmeer went to see his cousin, the doll maker, painter, and gilder, Christoph Zacharias Drosselmeer, whom he had not seen in many years. The clockmaker told him all about Princess Pirlipat, the Lady Mouserings, and the Nutcracker. The doll maker clapped his hands in amazement and said, "What a marvelous story!" Drosselmeer further related his adventures of how he had spent 2 years with the King of Dates, how the Prince of Almonds had disdainfully rejected him, how his search at the Society of Natural Science in Squirrelton had yielded nothing, and how he had failed everywhere to find even a trace of the Nutcracker. Through the story, Christoph Zacharias frequently snapped his fingers and turned around on one foot. Finally, he exclaimed, "Well, that'd be the devil, wouldn't it?" and threw his hat and wig into the air. He gave the clockmaker a hug and said, Cousin, all of your troubles are over, because unless all the world has conspired to deceive me, I own the Nutcracker." He immediately brought out a box from which he pulled a gilded nut of moderate size. "Behold," he said, "many years ago a nut seller with a bag of nuts came into town around Christmas time. He got into a fight with a local nut seller who didn't think he had any right selling nuts here outside of my shop, and had to set his bag down. Then a heavily loaded cart drove over it and broke all of the nuts except one. The stranger offered it to me with the oddest smile for a 20 from 1720. Strangely enough, that's just the coin I found when I checked my pocket. So I bought it and gilded it without really knowing why I paid so much for it or why I'd wanted it so badly." Any doubt that the nut wasn't really Krakatuk was soon lifted when the astronomer scraped off the gold gilding and found the word Krakatuk engraved in Chinese characters. The joy of the travelers was immense, and his cousin was the happiest man under the sun when Drosselmeer told him that his fortune was made, for he would soon receive a handsome pension and plenty of gold for gilding. Both wizard and astronomer had just put on their nightcaps and were ready to go to bed when the latter said, "My esteemed colleague, good fortune never comes but in packs. Not only have we found the Nutcracker, but also the young man to break it and present the princess with the core of beauty. No, I cannot sleep now," he said excitedly. "I must draw up this young man's horoscope this very night." With that, he tore off his nightcap and began at once to observe the stars. Christoph Zacharias' son was a handsome boy who had never shaved and had never worn boots. In his early childhood, he had been a jumping jack for a few Christmases, but there was no trace of that now, as his father had taught him how to be a proper gentleman. During the Christmas season, which was now, he wore a red coat trimmed in gold, a sword, a hat carried under his arm, and an excellent wig. Thus he stood splendidly in his father's shop, and gallantly cracked nuts for young girls, and for this reason they had nicknamed him Nutcracker. The next morning the astronomer gave the wizard a hug and said, "Here he is! We have him! Now, there are two things we must not ignore. First, you must make your splendid nephew a sturdy wooden tail that attaches under the jawbone, so that his jaw can be firmly shut therewith. And then, we must not reveal that we have the young man who will crack the nut when we arrive at the palace, but instead, he must wait for some time to reveal himself, for I have read in the horoscope that after a few young men have broken their teeth on Krakatuk, the king will promise the kingdom and the hand of the princess in marriage to whomever can crack the nut open and restore the princess's beauty." The dollmaker was pleased to have his son marry the princess and become prince and later king, so he gave him up to the travelers. The little wooden tail Drosselmeer attached to his hopeful young nephew's head worked so well that he was able to crack the hardest of peach pits. Drosselmeer and the astronomer reported to the palace that they had found the nut Krakatuk, and the palace immediately issued requests for young men who might break the nut. Many arrived to try their own sturdy teeth on the nuts and restore the princess, including a few princes. Our two travelers were considerably startled when they saw the princess. Her shriveled body, with its tiny hands and feet, could hardly carry her enormous head. The ugliness of her face was enhanced by a cotton-white beard that had sprouted around her mouth and on her chin. Everything happened exactly as the astronomer predicted. Young men with shoes on their feet and peach fuzz on their faces bit down on the nut Krakatuk and only got a few broken teeth and a sore jaw for their troubles, without helping the princess in the slightest. Every young man who had injured himself thus would be carried away half fainting by specially appointed dentists. Many could be heard sighing, "That was a hard nut." The king, now fearing that his daughter might never be restored, promised the kingdom and the princess to whomever could crack the nut. At that moment, young Drosselmeer stepped out and asked if he could try to crack the nut. None of the other young men had caught the princess's eye the way young Drosselmeer had. She put her little hands over her heart and sighed. "Oh, let it be this one who breaks the nut and becomes my husband." After paying his respects to the king, queen, and princess, the latter especially politely, he took the nut from the Grand Master of Ceremonies. He put it in his mouth and tugged at the tail Drosselmeer had made for him. And crack, crack, the shell broke into many pieces. The young man removed the fibers from the core of the nut, closed his eyes, gave it to the princess, and began his 7 steps backwards. The princess swallowed the core, and, oh wonders! An angelically beautiful young lady stood before them with a face of lily white and rose red, eyes like azure, and hair like curled strands of gold. Trumpets and drums mingled with the cheers of the people. The king and his court danced on one leg as they had the day of the princess's birth, and the queen had to be revived with strong-smelling perfumes because she had fainted from happiness. The commotion did not at all ruffle young Drosselmeer, who was just taking his 7th and last step. But then who should pop out of a crack in the floor but Lady Mousetrap, ugly, squeaking, and squealing, and right under the young man's heel. This caused him to stumble so that he almost fell. Oh, calamity! The boy was instantly as hideous as Princess Pirlipap had been a few moments ago. His shriveled body could hardly hold up his ugly head with its protruding green eyes and hideously wide smile. Instead of the little tail the clockmaker had made for him, a small wooden cloak hung from his shoulders that controlled his jaw. The clockmaker and astronomer were beside themselves with horror. Then they saw Lady Mousetrap roll onto the floor. Her malice had not gone unavenged, for the pointed heel of young Drosselmeer's shoe had hit her sharply and fatally in the neck. The fear of death had seized her, for she squeaked and squealed piteously. "Oh, Krakatuk, hard nut, now I must die! Hee-hee-pee-pee! Nutcracker, young man, you too will die! My 7-crowned son will avenge my death and take from you your living breath! Oh, life, so vibrant and red, I squeak!" With that, the Mouse Queen died and was promptly carried away to the royal furnace for disposal. In the heat of the moment, everyone had forgotten the young Drosselmeer, but the princess reminded the king of his promise, and he immediately ordered that the young man be brought before them. But upon seeing how hideous the unfortunate boy had become, the princess held her hands over her face and cried, "Take him away! Take that horrible Nutcracker away!" The chamberlain seized him by the shoulders and drew him out the door. The king was furious that someone had tried to give him a nutcracker for a son-in-law, and blamed everything on the clockmaker and the astronomer, whom he banished forever. None of these developments had been in the horoscope taken at Nuremberg, but the astronomer was not deterred from reading the stars again, which now revealed that young Drosselmeer would become a prince and a king despite his ugliness. Furthermore, he could lift the curse put upon him if he could defeat the 7-headed mouse born to Lady Mousetrap after the death her 7 sons, and find a lady who would love him despite his looks. You may have seen young Drosselmeer in his father's shop in Nuremberg around Christmas time, and now you know that he is not just a nutcracker, but also a prince. And now you know the tale of the hard nut, why people say that was a hard nut to crack, and how the nutcracker became so ugly. Thus the judge ended his story. Marie thought that the Princess Pirlipat was a cruel, ungrateful brat, and Fritz said that if the nutcracker was worth anything, he'd quickly defeat the Mouse King and get restored to his former self again.
Chapter 10, Uncle and Nephew, narrated by Ty Harper.
If any of my dear readers have ever cut themselves on glass, then they know how badly it hurts and how dreadfully slowly it heals. Marie had to spend almost a whole week in bed because she became dizzy whenever she tried to get up. But at last she recovered and could run and play as merrily as before. The glass cabinet had been repaired as good as new, and was again filled with trees, flowers, houses, and beautiful dolls. Marie was thrilled to see her beloved Nutcracker standing on the second shelf, smiling with all of his teeth intact. As she looked at her favorite toy, she remembered the story Drosselmeer had told of the history of the Nutcracker and his quarrel with Lady Mousetrap and her son. She realized that her Nutcracker could be none other than the pleasant, but unfortunately cursed, young Drosselmeer from Nuremberg. The clockmaker from the court of Pirlipat's father could be none other than Judge Drosselmeer, which Marie had never once doubted.
But why? Why didn't your uncle help you?
It became clear to Marie that the battle she had seen was in fact a battle for the Nutcracker's kingdom and crown. Were not the dolls his subjects, and had he not fulfilled the astronomer's predictions by becoming their leader? As the clever Marie pondered over this, the more she thought of the Nutcracker and the dolls as living people, and she half expected them to start moving about. But they remained stiff and motionless in the cabinet. But Marie, certain beyond any doubt that they really were alive, decided it was because of Lady Mousetrap's curse.
But,
she said to Nutcracker,
even if you can't move or speak, dear Mr. Drosselmeer, I know that you can understand me. I know it very well. You can count on me to help you if you need it. At the very least, I'll ask your uncle if he can help.
Nutcracker didn't move or stir, but Marie thought she heard a faint sigh and a gentle voice through the cabinet, just barely audible.
Little Marie, guardian sweet, I'm yours to keep, little Marie.
A shiver ran down Marie's spine, but she was comforted nonetheless. Dusk fell, and her father stepped into the room with Godfather Drosselmeer. Before long, Louise had arranged the tea table, and the family sat down and had a merry conversation. Marie quietly moved her little easy-chair near Drosselmeer's feet and sat down. When everyone had quieted down, she looked up at the judge with her big blue eyes and said,
Godfather Drosselmeer, I realize that the Nutcracker is your nephew, the young Drosselmeer from Nuremberg, and that he has become king, as the astronomer had predicted. But you already know this, and that he is at battle with the son of Lady Mousetrap. Why don't you help him?
Marie once again told everyone about the battle and how it went. Everyone, except for Fritz and Drosselmeer, began laughing. Where does the girl get such ridiculous ideas into her head? Dr. Strahlbaum asked.
She's always had a vivid imagination, her mother said.
These are just dreams brought about by her fever. It's not true, any of it, Fritz said. My hussars aren't such cowards. If they were, I'd personally discipline them. But Godfather Drosselmier put Marie on his lap, and, with an odd smile, said very quietly, Dear Marie, you were born a princess like Pelepat, for you rule a bright and beautiful land. But you will have to suffer much if you are to look after Nutcracker, for the Mouse King will pursue him in every land and across any border. I cannot help him. Only you can do that. Be faithful and strong. Neither Marie nor anyone else knew what to say after that. The doctor took Drosselmier's pulse and said, You have, my esteemed friend, a severe head cold. I'll write you out a prescription. But Mrs. Strawbum shook her head slowly and said quietly, I think I know what he's saying, but I can't quite explain it.
Chapter 11, The Victory. Narrated by Ty Harper.
It wasn't long after that incident that Marie was wakened one moonlit night by a strange rumbling that seemed to come from the corner of the room. It was as if small stones were being thrown about with squeaks and squeals mixed in.
The mice have come back,
Marie cried in surprise. She wanted to wake her mother, but found herself unable to make a sound or move a muscle. She could only watch as the Mouse King squeezed himself through a hole in the wall. His 14 eyes and 7 crowns glistened as he bounded through the room and made a huge leap to the top of Marie's nightstand. I must have your sugar balls and marzipan, or I will bite your Nutcracker through. He squeaked and gnashed his teeth hideously. Then he jumped off the table and disappeared through the hole in the wall. Marie was so frightened by his horrific appearance that the next morning she was very pale and could barely say a word. 100 times she wanted to tell her mother, Louise, or at least Fritz, what had happened. But she thought,
Will they believe me, or will they laugh at me?
But one thing was certain, and that was that she would have to give up her sugar balls and marzipan. She put each and every piece in front of the toy cabinet that night. The next morning her mother said,
I don't know how all these mice got into our living room. Look, Marie, they've eaten all your candy.
Indeed they had. The marzipan wasn't to the Mouse King's taste, but he nibbled it with his sharp teeth so that it had to be thrown out. Marie wasn't concerned with the candy, however. She was quite happy inside, for she believed that the Nutcracker was safe. But that night she heard a dreadful squeaking and squealing right by her ear. The Mouse King was there again, and looked even more horrible than before. His eyes gleamed, and he hissed more threateningly from between his gnashing teeth. I must have more. Give me your sugar dolls, or I'll bite your Nutcracker through. And he jumped away again. Marie was very sad. The next morning she went to the cabinet and looked mournfully at her sugar dolls. Her pain was not unreasonable. Her sugar dolls were beautifully shaped and molded into figures even you might find difficult to believe. A shepherd and shepherdess looked after grazing flocks of milky white lambs while their merry little dogs scampered about. 2 mailmen walked with letters in their hand, and 4 handsome couples, men in dapper suits and women in beautiful dresses, rocked in a Russian swing. Behind that there were dancers, then Patcher Feldkamel and Joan of Arc, whom Marie didn't particularly care about, but in the corner stood a red-cheeked child, Marie's favorite. Tears welled from her eyes.
Oh,
she exclaimed, turning to the Nutcracker.
Dear Mr. Drosselmier, I'll do everything I can to save you, but it's very hard.
She looked at the Nutcracker, who looked so helpless that she couldn't help but imagine the Mouse King with all 7 mouths open to devour the unfortunate young man. At that she was ready to sacrifice everything. She took all of her sugar dolls and set them by the base of the cabinet as she had with the sugar balls and marzipan the night before. She kissed the shepherd and the shepherdess, the lambs, and her favorite, the red-cheeked child, which she put in the very back. Patcher Feldkamel and Joan of Arc were put in front.
Now that's too bad,
Marie's mother said the next morning.
A very big and nasty mouse must live in the toy cabinet.
because poor Marie's sugar dolls are all gnawed and chewed up." Marie could not keep herself from crying, but she soon smiled again when she thought to herself, "What does it matter? Nutcracker is safe." That evening, after Marie's mother told the judge about the damage caused by the mouse in the cabinet, Dr. Strahlbaum said, "It's a shame we can't exterminate that infernal mouse that's destroying Marie's candy." "Hey," Fritz interrupted enthusiastically, "the baker down the street has got a big gray cat I'd like to bring up. He'll take care of things and bite off that mouse's head, even if it's Lady Mousetrap or the Mouse King himself." Their mother laughed. "And jump around on tables and couches, knock down glasses and cups, and cause 1,000 other damages." "Oh, no he wouldn't," Fritz protested. "He's a clever cat. I wish I could walk as gracefully on the roof as he does." "Please, no tomcats tonight," said Lois, who could not tolerate cats. "Actually, Fritz has a point," Dr. Strahlbaum said. "But could we set up a trap, or do we have none?" "Godfather Drosselmayer can make one. He invented them," Fritz said. Everyone laughed, and after Mrs. Strahlbaum informed everyone that there were no mousetraps in the house, the judge announced that he had several, and within an hour he had gone to his home and brought back a splendid mousetrap. The tale of the hard nut was very much alive inside Fritz and Marie's heads. When Marie saw Dora the cook, whom she knew quite well, browning the fat, all of the stories came rushing back to her head. She began to tremble, and she blurted, "Oh, my queen, beware of Mouserings and her family." At that Fritz drew his sword and said, "If any of them show up here, I'd take them out." Later, as Fritz watched Drosselmayer bait the mousetrap and set it into the cabinet, he said, "Careful, Godfather Drosselmayer, that the Mouse King doesn't play some trick on you." That night Marie felt something like ice-cold feet crawling up her arm, and something rough and disgusting brush against her cheek. There was a horrible squealing in her ear. The Mouse King sat on her shoulder. He drooled blood red, gnashed his teeth even more ferociously than before, and hissed into Marie's ear.
"Don't go to the house. Don't go to the feast. Can't let yourself get caught like a wretched little beast. Give me all your picture books. Give me your Christmas dress, or I'll nibble Nutcracker all to bits, and you'll never have any peace. Squeak!"
Marie was miserable and visibly distressed. She was haggard and pale, and when her mother, who thought that Marie was still upset over her candy and terrified of the mouse, noticed this, she said, "I'm afraid that nasty mouse hasn't been caught yet." Then she added, "But we'll get it, don't worry. If the trap doesn't work, we'll have Fritz bring up the baker's cat." As soon as Marie was alone in the living room, she stood in front of the glass cabinet and sobbing said, "Oh, Mr. Drosselmayer, what more can an unfortunate girl like me do for you? The Mouse King wants my picture book and the dress the Christ child gave me, and when he's bitten through those, he'll just demand more. I'm afraid when I run out of things to give him, he'll want to bite me up instead. What am I supposed to do now?" As Marie complained to the Nutcracker, she noticed a large spot of blood on his neck. Since learning that the Nutcracker was really Drosselmayer's nephew, she no longer carried him about in her arm, nor kissed him as she had before, and, in fact, she found herself becoming quite shy in front of him. However, she removed him from the toy cabinet and wiped away the blood with her handkerchief. Suddenly, she felt him growing warm in her hand, even moving. She quickly set him down, and he spoke with apparent difficulty. "My dear Miss Strahlbaum, to whom I owe everything, do not sacrifice your picture book or your Christmas dress for me. I just need a sword. If I had a sword, I could—" And suddenly he stopped, and his melancholic eyes became still and lifeless once more. Marie was no longer frightened or worried. In fact, she jumped with joy because she now knew how to save the Nutcracker without sacrificing any more of her treasured possessions. But where to find a sword? She decided to ask Fritz, and that evening, after their parents had departed from the living room, told him the complete story of what had happened in front of the toy cabinet that fateful night, and what she had to do to save Nutcracker now. Fritz had never thought over anything as hard than what he should do with his hussars after he heard from Marie how badly they'd performed in battle. He asked her very seriously whether it was really true, and after Marie assured him that it was, he hurried to the glass-fronted cabinet and gave them a stern speech. Then he cut the insignias off their caps and forbade them from playing the Hussars' March for a year. Then he turned to Marie and said, "I can help the Nutcracker with a sword. I just retired an old colonel of the cuirassiers with a pension yesterday, and he's got a bright and shiny sword he won't be needing any more." The aforementioned colonel was making use of his pension in the back corner of the third shelf. Fritz brought him out, removed his silver sword, and hung it from the Nutcracker's belt. That night, Marie was so anxious she was unable to sleep. She could hear clattering and banging coming from the living room, and suddenly, squeak! "The Mouse King! The Mouse King!" cried Marie, and jumped out of her bed in fright. For a while it was completely quiet. Then there was a knock at the door, and a small voice said, "Excellent Mrs. Stahlbaum, be glad of heart, for I have good news." Marie recognized the voice of young Mr. de Selmier, and she threw on her dressing gown and quickly opened the door. Nutcracker stood outside the door with a bloody sword in one hand and a candle in the other. He knelt down on one knee and said, "You, and you alone, my lady, have given me the courage of a knight to fight the insolent scoundrel who dared treat you so disrespectfully. The treacherous Mouse King now lies mortally wounded and wallowing in his own blood. Please accept, my lady, these tokens of my victory from your devoted knight." The Nutcracker removed the 7 crowns he had strung over his left arm and presented them to Marie, who accepted them gladly. Nutcracker rose to his feet and said, "My excellent lady, with my enemy defeated, I can now show you the most wonderful things. If you will kindly follow me for a short while, please come with me. Please come, excellent lady."
To be continued. Wishing you sweet dreams. This is Crystal, and now the talented singer-songwriter, Sarah Kowalski, will be sending you off to sleep with a song.
What a fun time that we've had with you, sharing this story that you maybe never knew. Now it's that time for you to rest your eyes and take your own adventure of fun and surprise. Who knows what exciting stories of your own await you in dreamland, a place you call home. Bedtime stories bid you good night. Bedtime stories will turn out your light. It's time for us to go to